So today we are going to talk about Java. So who of you is Java developer? And who is not a Java developer? So why you're here then? No, just kidding. So today I'm going to show you how you can deploy a Spring Boot application on Microsoft Azure. And I'm going to show a bit of the offerings that they have for enterprise Java as well. But the first question actually should be, if you're in this session, why on earth would I run my Java application on Azure? Because probably you've already have it running in AWS or on a Kubernetes cluster somewhere. And actually, this is a very good question, and this is actually why I wanted to make this session, because usually, in my experience, Java developers, they don't think about Azure as their first thing when they want to deploy their application somewhere. So usually they think about AWS. So, and then I started to look into why that actually is. So part of it is because, well, AWS was earlier. They beat Azure in time to market, so AWS was already launched in 2008, and Azure launched in 2010, actually by then still as Windows Azure. So with no focus on open source, Java, Linux, or whatsoever. So, and one thing that Amazon did very well with the introduction of AWS is that they spent a lot of effort in the open source community. They heavily invested in Unix and Linux offerings, and they tried to become really good friends with the open source community. And that led to many Java developers embracing that platform first and basically not looking for other options. You can also see it in the graph down here. I put the market share for IaaS and PaaS services per cloud service providers. You can see that AWS has been steadily above 30% market share for like the last decade. They begin to decline slowly as of 2021. And you see Azure was in 2015 only 9% of the market, and it's now gone up rapidly to about 25% this year. So you see they're going closer together. And that's also something I see in my daily practice, is more and more people are running Java applications on Azure, which is a great thing. But actually, if we want to get down to the root cause of this issue, we have to go all the way back to 1975. So what happened in 1975? Anybody knows? Yes, very good. So actually, in 1975, Microsoft was founded as Micro-Soft by Bill Gates and a couple of other people. And as you may know, Bill Gates wasn't very fond of the idea of open source from the start. And the most blatant example of that actually happened a year after the company was launched. So in 1976, Bill Gates said, open source is threatening our business model. We shouldn't do it. It's a bad thing. And he wrote an open letter to the then biggest computing science journal in America. And I put that letter on the right. That he thought that too many people were actually stealing his software. So the first software that Microsoft launched was BASIC. So they launched an SDK for BASIC for people on their home computers to be able to write software. And Bill Gates saw that software was illegally distributed, early day piracy, people copying it, and he wasn't too happy about it because, of course, it would end up making him less money. So he wrote this letter, and it's here. You probably can't read the letter, but if you really want to read the whole letter, you can in the slideshow that I'll share afterwards. But I highlighted a couple of things. So the first thing he said about open source is that most of the people, that they just steal your software. They don't pay for it, they just get it for free. He said also, like, who can afford to do actual professional work for nothing? Actually, I think this is one of the core values of open source, is that because everybody contributes, you can have professional quality product for people doing it in their spare time, so it doesn't cost any money. But well, Mr. Gates had other beliefs. He also said, well, which is also I think very wrong, is that by actually copying that basic SDK, you would prevent more good software from being written. Well, if we have learned one thing about open source in the last 20 years, it's actually that it has led to more quality software being written rather than less. So he was definitely wrong about this one. And he said, nothing would please me more than be able to hire 10 programmers, so please buy my software so I can have more money to do that, basically. So because this was in the roots of Microsoft's company at the time, they didn't want to support open source, they didn't see a need to, they actually thought that it would help bring the company down. So you see that that only gradually slowed over the years. So in 1990, the actual CEO of Microsoft at the time said that stability and reliability is not feasible with open source. This was 1995, 96. And it was only in 2004 when Microsoft started to do their first open source contributions, which was for the Wix project. They did small contributions to have Wix being, at the time they made installer packages for Windows, and Microsoft patched some small things so the installers would run better on Windows. So in 2010, they started to engage more with the open source community by heavily investing time on Node.js. And in 2014, the .NET Foundation was founded, and the .NET framework became open source. And this really was a milestone for open source within Microsoft. By this time, Satya Nadella had become CEO, and he found that open source actually had a future and that Microsoft should start embracing it. And actually, this led to the GitHub merger in 2018, when actual Microsoft decided to make all their new endeavors open source, really, and host them on GitHub publicly. So with this keeping in mind, you can also see how they would have to have Java on the Azure platform as well, because Java is a major part of the open source community. So I put here on the screen a graph which shows the commits for different programming languages on GitHub at the time. So the yellow line at the top is JavaScript, then the brown line is normal Java, then you have PHP and C#. As you can see is that Java has been steadily being around 10% of the whole GitHub ecosystem. So it was too big for Microsoft to actually ignore that, and JavaScript was even bigger, so they couldn't ignore Node.js as well. So from 2018 onwards, Microsoft decided to invest to have support for these platforms on their compute services on Azure. So they started to support Java in app servers and web apps, but also Node.js and PHP. They launched services for containerized workloads and microservices, and new services that they developed were completely developed with open source in mind. So like Azure Cosmos DB, it was from the ground up completely developed to be cross-platform with SDKs for MongoDB, for SQL, for Cassandra, and with SDKs for all of these languages. So there is an SDK for Mongo for Java, Mongo for .NET, Mongo for Node in Cosmos DB, which is really great because it makes the life easier to go to a different programming language if you would so want to. So then if we look at what we have nowadays on the Azure platform that really works well with the Java ecosystem, we have a couple of things. So in the realm of compute, there's now support for Java 8, Java 11, And since April this year, also Java 17 on Azure App Service. So they also say when they launched Java 17, they dropped the support for Java 8. For Java 7. So it used to be Java 7, 8, and 11. And then from April onwards this year, they only do 8, 11, and 17, which I think is good because like we're already at Java 19, I believe, at the moment. So they needed 11 really was too old. So they also had some new support for some web servers. So for Tomcat, they support 8.5, 9.5, and 10. They also have support for JBoss and Java SE servers. They also added the option to publish Docker containers in app services. So you could actually bring your Java container straight into Azure App Service, even if your Java version wasn't supported on the platform natively, because it would be in your image anyway. And they invested in the ability to run Spring microservices on AKS, Azure Container Apps, or Azure Spring Cloud. So with databases, they did kind of the same thing. So you see Java developers, they embrace open source. They also like to use open source databases. So Microsoft said, yes, we need to have support for MySQL, for PostgreSQL, and MariaDB, which were the top 3 open source relational database technologies at the time. So they added all PaaS services for those. So they, in 2018, they started with Azure Cosmos DB, which is their NoSQL offering, a multimodal, scalable PaaS database with support for Cassandra, MongoDB, and Gremlin. And just recently at Ignite last week, they also added PostgreSQL support in Cosmos DB, which would be really great for Java developers that need to have scalable databases that are geo-redundant and need that modality that Cosmos DB offers. So that is really good. So together with the Spring Foundation, they launched Azure Spring Cloud in 2020, which basically is an enterprise-managed environment for Spring and Spring Boot applications, which becomes fully integrated with security monitoring, logging, IAM, compliancy, everything. So I'm not going to go deeply into that architecture today because I could do a whole different session about it. I actually have a whole session just on Azure Spring Cloud. But it's good to know that they work a lot alongside the Spring Foundation to keep the support for the Spring Framework and Spring Boot up to date within the Azure platform. So, on the other hand, Spring, they deliver starters for Azure Active Directory, Azure Key Vault, Storage, Cosmos DB, and I've 10 other services via Spring Initializer. So if you go to start.spring.io and if you start a new project, you can actually already load the dependencies for some of these Azure services, and you just only have to configure them in your POM XML, and then they will just work. So Spring also offers a whole GitHub repository with sample applications that use a variety of Azure Cloud Native services, so you can have a look and see actually how a service is configured and how it actually works, which actually is a good thing because the documentation on integrations with the Spring platform on the Microsoft side, they are not 100% up to date. They're a bit lacking, so actually looking from the examples and then basically taking that in, I would say that is way better than just looking at the docs, because 80% of the time you would be fine, but in sort of 20% you find the solution in the docs doesn't work. And also Spring developed the Spring Cloud Azure SDK, which is a Java SDK for connecting with all cloud native services in Azure, including Service Bus, Event Hubs, Redis, and Azure Functions. So, of course you are here for the demo, so I'm going to now close the slideshow and we're going to actually look at how this works. So if I would go to Spring Initializer, and then I would select a Maven project because I'm not a Java developer myself. I was 10 years ago and then I used Maven, so I will use Maven now as well. I put the latest stable here of Spring Boot, which is 2.7.5. So you put here your group. So I put here com AzConf demo, AzConf demo for my artifact. This is fine. I want the jar, that's really important. You need the jar packaging because the jar will be uploaded, in this case, to Azure Web Apps. And of course, I either select 8, 9, or 8, 11, or 17. So I pick 11 in this case. Because the demo I was building on Java 11, I haven't updated it to Java 17 yet because that was just released. And then I can add some components here. So if I type in Azure, you'll see that there is all kinds of Azure support already. So in this case, I want support for auto-configuring of those Azure native services. This is the Spring Cloud SDK for Azure, as I was talking about in the last slide. And in my demo, I have a key vault, so I also need a package for Azure Key Vault. And then I just click Generate, and I will get my project. So my project is now downloaded. So then, on the infrastructure side, like I said, we're going to deploy in a web app. So I need an app service. So I have my live resource group here. So we're going to deploy AzConf2022 Java. So this is going to be a normal code web app, so we're not going to do a static web app or a Docker container here, because I actually want to only deploy the code. So as you can see here, I can choose Java 17, 11, or Java 8. So I pick Java 11. You pick the web server. So in this case, I'll leave it on Java SE, but you can pick all these other ones as well. You can even run it on Windows. So the first thing I did was I did my demo on Windows. This is probably not the smartest idea, because when you select Windows here, your app service is actually much more expensive because you have to pay for the Windows license as well. So you're much better off choosing the Linux here, because then you don't pay for a license and it's like 20% off. And I already have I need an app service plan, so AzConf2022 Java ASP. And I'll just keep it as an S1 for now, which is good. I do not care about zone redundancy right now. You can now set up GitHub Actions directly with app service if you want, but I'm going to skip that here. So it's not going to be VNet injected. I do want an application insights instance. So I'm going to create a new one, which I call AzConf2022 Java AI. And then we're going to deploy this. And while this is deploying, I'll show you my code. So basically, when you get the project, so the Spring Boot project from Spring Initializer, you'll get all the boilerplate, even with Maven or Gradle, depending on what build tool you chose. So I chose Maven here. So that means that all my dependencies are here in the pom.xml. And let me actually, I need to start my Zoom tool because I didn't do that. Oh, no, sorry. Because otherwise you cannot see this. Yeah, this should be really fast. This tool says it searches everything really fast. Yeah. So this is the POM XML. So for standard Maven model version 4.0, as you can see, I have put it here for Java 11 because I'm going to use Java 11. Then it will have indicated my dependencies for Com Azure for the Key Vault starter. So because I selected the Key Vault dependency, I'll get the Key Vault Secret Starter version 3.14, and because I selected the Cloud SDK for Azure, I'm getting Application Insights as well. And what is really important is that you need to have the Azure Web App Maven plugin. This plugin actually decides on where you're going to deploy this application. So you put in here the subscription of your Azure subscription, the resource group, the name of your app, the tier, where it is, the app service plan name, the resource group where the app service is in, and the OS. So it's Windows in this case, with Java 11 on Java SE. And this is basically the only thing you have to put in. Now let's see if actually good, my deployment is ready. Azure is really fast these past 2 days, from which I am really grateful. So then I will just go to the live resource group. So I have these things here. So because I want to use everything from the demo, I will actually change some things here. So the app name needs to change. This needs to become AzConf. I think I called it AzConf2022 Live. The ASP is going to be also called differently, so that is going to be called like this. So I also changed that. This is also going to be the different one, live. So now I save this, and then I should be okay. So what did I put in this application? Actually, in my actual application class, I do not have to provide any Azure-related things. This is just a plain Spring Boot starter application. It will start a main loop with my application on it, as you can see here. And it will inspect the beans. I added one controller, and I imported 2 packages. So actually imported Application Insights Telemetry Client and the Metric Telemetry. To show you a couple things, I have a general index which returns something. I'm returning a secret from Azure Key Vault. So I'm binding here with a bean to a Key Vault secret. Because this is implemented in the SDK, in the Maven, in the Spring Boot SDK for Azure, I don't have to do any other things that this is going to be from Azure. I just put in the $ with the brackets and my secret name, and then it will pick it up. And I have done some telemetry. So I'm using the telemetry client from Application Insights to create track a custom event. And therefore I need to do some compute, so let's compute the Fibonacci sequence. So then it's basically really easy. I can do an mvm install, and then it will build locally. Oh, I'm actually not in the correct folder, so I need to be cd in. Yes. So I'm doing an mvm install now. And then the only thing I have to do is to run this command, mvm package azure-web app deploy. This will use the deploy configuration that is in my POM XML. So it will first be building the application, then it will try to target the web app. So then I have to log in, so to get an OAuth2 token to actually be able to deploy into my web app. Oh, so it's now complaining about my subscription. Is that still the wrong one? No, that should be correct. Cannot get subscription for tenant. Oh, it is problem with the refill. Oh, it's actually doing it. Oh, good. It was just a warning, not an error. I thought I got an error, but. So you can see it's now updating the web app, AzConf2022 Java. And now it's trying to deploy the artifact. So it's now going to take the jar and put the jar file actually on the web app and then extract it. And then the OpenJDK runtime that is on the actual web app will pick it up and start hosting it. So this will try to take a little bit of time. In the meanwhile, I will show you application insights. So I'll open some live telemetry here. So now all of a sudden Azure is very slow. So like we probably all know live telemetry, right, from application insights. That's really cool. This also works out of the box with Spring Boot and Java applications. Once it is deployed. Yeah, so it says at 2 minutes, 6 seconds, and it was deployed. So now if we go to the web app, should. Again, it's not very fast, is it? Yesterday we didn't have this problem. Now, come on, Azure. I don't have like all day. So the live metrics are actually up. So you will see it will tell you here that it's not supported for this SDK, so for a Java web app, but you'll see that once traffic gets flowing to the application, you will actually get the sample telemetry. So I really have to refresh this because this is taking way too long. Otherwise, let me try to then form the URI myself. So that would be AzConf2022 java.azurewebsites.net. Okay, so here this is the default landing page. So we know that the application code is not actually up yet because I also pre-deployed this yesterday. And if I use this one, it will actually tell me, hey, AzConf, we're awesome, of course. And then I can also get the secret. So now it's getting the key vault secret. It's actually the same secret and the same key vault I used yesterday. You can see here. And that I'm using managed identity authentication for that. So that means that on my key vault, I'm having an access policy for the app itself. So here for AzConf2022, I have it for the app and I have system assigned managed identity turned on for the app. So we can see that here, that I turned on the system assigned managed identity, which is actually, I think, a great feature of Azure. You can inject it into Azure Active Directory and actually have the roles and the permissions on your actual app instead of on a principal for which you need to rotate a password and so on. So let me check if the actual live one is already up. Again, no, this still is not showing the actual application code. I'm actually getting an exception still here. So it's still busy installing the application, spinning up the JVM. Let's go back to the presentation and we'll revisit this later. because it usually takes about a couple of minutes, about 5 minutes. So this is basically how you deploy a Java app in Azure, but also for you as a developer, your developer experience is also very important. So therefore, there are also some great things Azure has in the IDE. So there is a Azure Toolkit plugin for JetBrains IntelliJ and Eclipse, because of course I am using Visual Studio Code right now because I'm not a Java developer, but probably none of your Java developers here will use VS Code. So how many of you use IntelliJ? That's like most of the Java. And how many use Eclipse? That's about the other half. And how many use VS Code for Java development? Oh, so also 4. So for VS Code, you can do it automatically with the Azure Toolkit in VS Code, but you also have a really cool extension for both IntelliJ and Eclipse. You also have emulators for Azure Storage and Azure Cosmos DB, so you do not actually have to deploy resources into a resource group. You can also just use the emulators. And as I showed you, you can do live real-time monitoring and tracing and application insights. This is by default supported for Java 8, 11, and 17 for both the Linux and Windows containers, just as you would on a .NET application. And it will save your data to Log Analytics Workspace, which is really good. You also have the Azure CLI, which is a Bash command line interface that is 100% feature complete with Azure PowerShell. But this also runs on macOS and Linux. So that's really great because probably most Java developers will use either macOS or Linux. Do we have any Java developers on Windows here? Yeah, so only 2, yeah. So usually you will either use, and for Azure PowerShell that could be problematic because only PowerShell Core works on Linux now and macOS. So Azure CLI is great for that. Then I also want to tell you something about that you don't have to switch to Azure completely. It's still fine to use AWS for some services because multi-cloud is gaining popularity by the month, it seems like. So you can do storage in AWS, compute in Azure, and you'll still be fine. If you're going to do that, I would advise you to use an independent IAC language, such as Terraform. Otherwise, you would have to do your Azure stuff in Bicep or ARM, and then you would have to do your AWS stuff in CloudFormation. So I would advise to use it in Terraform because then you can combine both. So the support for AWS in Terraform is quite a bit bigger than for Azure, but this is catching up because I did this session in April and we were on 700 packages for Azure. Now we're almost at 1,000. But as you can see, AWS is still way more supported on Terraform. But I think this is the best multi-cloud infrastructure as code platform there is right now. Things like Pulumi or other variants, they even have less support for these 3. So I think Microsoft has come strong back with open source support since 2014 and even since 2018, since the GitHub merger. It's also the market leader in identity access management and on-premise integrations. So if you do need to do a lot of AAD integrations or integrations with MS365 apps with your Java application, then I would say Microsoft Azure is a much better platform than AWS. But it's not about the one is better than the other. You should be able to use both of them coexistently. So choose whatever fits your purposes most, I would say. So then we come back to the question that I asked you at the beginning of this session. So why would I run my Java application on Azure? Well, basically, you would want to do that if you would have a lot of on-premise integrations, if you would want to use the identity ecosystem. But I would advise you that you choose the cloud solution provider that best fits the demands of your application, to not be afraid to use more than one public cloud, because multi-cloud is going to be the future, and to utilize the unique selling points of each provider and to avoid the feature gaps that even Azure on Java still has. And then I think you'll be fine. So let's get back to the demo to see if it's already up. So the live one. So it's actually not yet up. No, so it's still giving me socket exceptions, I think. Yeah, so this sometimes happens. So that's a bit too... That's a pity. So that was it for today. Thank you.